Dickens and the Rise of the Novel, 1812 to 1870, his life and his time. So we're going to be talking about his books, and we're going to be talking about people that he worked with and interacted with. You know, he was a writer, he needed publishers, he needed booksellers, and so we're going to talk about some of those folks as well. 1812, I relate things to American history. So I think, okay, 1812, he was born during the war, the Second War of Independence with England, and he died 1870, the end of the Civil War. So that kind of helps me to root it in our time. And of course, in England's time, 1812 to 1870, so much was going on. Of course, that was the end of the Napoleonic Wars, 1815 for that. Then the Industrial Revolution, England becoming a world power, global trade, sun never sets on the British Isles, et cetera, an enormously important time in England's growth and development. But let me tell you how I get started on Dickens. We were up in Windsor, Vermont, and I'm wondering if you can see this book here. It's called The Western Canon. It's written by Harold Bloom. Harold Bloom was a literature professor at Yale, became a professor emeritus, and I had the great good fortune to spend an hour one-on-one with him discussing some aspect of literature, which I have since forgotten. But I saw the book. They were doing, the library was doing some type of sale. I bought it for $3, and there was an essay in it in which Dr. Bloom compared Dickens to Shakespeare. And he said that in Dickens' 15 novels, he thought that Dickens had created more interesting and varied characters than Shakespeare did. Well, first of all, I was surprised that Dickens wrote 15 novels. At the time, I did not know that. And then the comparison to Shakespeare is such a favorable way. And Bloom wanted to describe the characters and the complexities and their humor. And I set a goal for myself. I'm going to read all 15 of these novels. Well, like many of you, I've read maybe 2 or 3, some of them in high school. And so this is a goal. I'm going to read all 15. So along the way, I also, Dickens wrote 2 travel books. I read those. And I read a couple of his novellas. And my daughter, Lauren, I have 2 daughters. My daughter, Lauren, noticed a strange obsession. I'm going to hold up this book. I hope you can see it. It's called Dickens' Fur Coat in Charlotte's Unanswered Letters. It's written by Daniel Poole. And it's all about Dickens' life and the lives of his contemporaries and what it was like in England during that time period. And so I got lots of more information about Dickens from that book. And then thirdly, I was at the library and I came across Peter Ackroyd's biography of Dickens, which is over 1,000 pages. I know at this point you're all feeling sorry for me, but I read the whole 1,000 pages and learned more about Dickens. And I'm sure you're feeling sorry for Donna at the same time. What is wrong with this man? But I was really enjoying it. And at the time, Lois Asher was doing lots of lectures for the village, and Paula Wright was doing these terrific travelogues and others. And I thought, well, maybe I could put together a little 1-hour presentation about Dickens and what happened during his lifetime to the novel. Because when he was young and getting started, poets were the kings. You know, I mean, Shelley and Keats, Coleridge and Wordsworth and Lord Byron, all those people were alive still and publishing. And they were really the top of the literary hierarchy. Novelists always published under pseudonyms or anonymously, and they were at best second class, not quite gentlemen. There were lady novelists, of course, and they also wrote anonymously. And I'd like to talk more about them at a later time. And of course, if you wrote for the theater or we even engaged in the theater, you were way down on the hierarchy scale. So poets were the kings, novelists not so much. During Dickens' lifetime, a lot of that changed. Dickens really kind of raised the whole atmosphere of novel writing. And he was incredibly popular during his time. So and he earned that popularity at a very early age. And really, although he had some novels that didn't really work, still he kept that popularity throughout his lifetime. There is a couple of quick stories I'd like to tell you. The novel, the book that my daughter got me, Dickens' Fur Coat, the title comes from the fact that on his first tour of the United States, it was winter time, and he came prepared with this immense fur coat because he was going to be doing lots of traveling and be out in the wilderness areas as well as the big cities. And a crowd of people noticed him in New York, and they mobbed him. I mean, there's Dickens, and they all clustered around him and actually ripped the clothes off his back. They all wanted a piece of him. He was giving lectures. There'd be hundreds and hundreds of people showing up at dinners, people waiting outside. It was like when the Beatles traveled to England, to the United States in the 60s when we were all teenagers. You know, he was that popular even in America. And there's another story, because later in his life, he went on the stage and he did readings from his books. And in a theater in Manchester, the crowd was so dense trying to get in the theater. The whole front of it was glass windows, and the crowd just pressed up against the windows, crashed through into the lobby, shattering all those windows. He was immensely popular. So we see he was born in 1812. So in 2012 was his bicentenary, 200 years. And a publisher in England produced a commemorative 5-novel booklet, a series of books, and sold 1 million copies. So popular in his day, popular in these days. So we're going to dig into some of the stories and some of the characters that were around him. Now, I mentioned that he wrote 15 novels. I hope that this shows up on your screen. I know when I showed it to Joyce earlier, kind of bled off the edges of her screen. But here are the 15 novels, amongst some other things, other books and notes, and organized by decades: 1830, 40, 50, 60, and 70. And in 1870, you see there's only one entry, The Mystery of Edwin Drood, which was a mystery novel that he was writing. It's unfinished because he died. He died at age 58. And if there's anybody who can be said to have worked himself to death, it is Charles Dickens. He had an immense amount of energy, and he employed it every day, it seems. So 1830, actually, I could get lost in this one screen, and I don't want to do that because I know I only have an hour of your time. So I'm going to limit myself to trying to make 2 points. If you buy a nice edition of a Dickens novel, more than likely at the very beginning, you're going to see a chronology, and it's going to give you something similar to this, and it'll talk about what was going on. And you're going to see that Dickens spent a great deal of his time editing magazines. Now, that was something that as a fact, I knew. I just kind of went over it. In the back of my mind, I kind of wondered, like, why is this fabulous novelist wasting his time with magazines? But look at 1830. He gets famous right after the Pickwick Papers, and I'll talk about that in some real detail later. But then he starts to become an editor of Bentley's Miscellany. It's a monthly magazine. He does it for 2 years. Then he moves over in 1840 to editor of Master Humphrey's Clock, and he does that for another 2 years. So there's 4 years right at the beginning of his career. He's spending his time editing a monthly magazine. Now, all of his works came out in serial editions, either monthly, some of them actually weekly, not too many. And that's the way everybody published, and we can talk about why a little bit later on. So you can see those are the 4 years. Then you go over to 1850, and you come down like 2 blocks, and you see editor of Household Words. And he does that for 9 years, and he's a principal. Not only is he an editor, but he owns close to about 50% of it. He was in business with a publisher. And then at the bottom of the 1850 column, you can see again, editor all year round, 1859. Here he owns the whole thing. So, and he does that actually towards the end of his life when he passed it on to one of his sons who did it really to about 1890, honestly, kept that going. And the household words and all year round, those were weekly magazines. So a significant chunk of Dickens' life was spent editing and publishing in magazines. So this was very important to him. Not only did he organize his life around it, but when you think about writing a novel and you've got to do it with a certain number of pages that are going to come out every month, it really structures the work for you as well. So that's point one. Now, point two is that you can take these works and you can kind of put them into two chunks. There's the early author, brilliant, energetic, really can tell a story that's going to keep you interested, a real page turner, but a little disorganized. Now, Dickens, so that's chunk one. Chunk two is the mature author, absolutely at the top of his game, producing masterpiece after masterpiece, because he's learned the art and he's learned how to really tell these tales in a way that is pleasing to everybody, including the literary critics. You write a story and you're lucky you get it reviewed. Well, maybe you're not lucky to have it reviewed too. And that happened to Dickens. There were literary critics in the early days, and they took a look at his works and they said, tells a nice story, but it's very disorganized, doesn't even seem like a novel. And let's talk about some of these books, because that was true. So Pickwick Papers in the 1830s column, that was never intended to be a novel. That was just going to come out in the monthly editions. And then as Dickens really kind of got into his stride, he attempted to kind of wrap that into a novel type of framework. Oliver Twist, same type of thing. Nicholas Nickleby, the same. These are very what's called episodic. This happens, then that happens, then this happens, and that happens. So when he started these, he had an idea of the main story. He had an idea of the characters, maybe a rough idea of the ending. And then it was just all kind of automatic coming out of his genius. And they're brilliant. I don't mean to say that they're not. So Pickwick Papers, hugely successful. Oliver Twist, hugely successful. Same with Nicholas Nickleby. Then the Old Curiosity Shop had a wonderful little girl character by the name of Little Nell. And there was another story about this in New York, because they would ship over the editions from England where they were printed, went into New York. There was a riot on the wharf as people were waiting for the next edition of the Old Curiosity to show up. They wanted to know if Little Nell was still alive. Now, if they knew Dickens like we do at this point, of course, no, of course she's dead. You know, Dickens, she's a wonderful little girl and she's fighting against all the odds. Of course she's going to die, and she did. So Barnaby Rudge was his first failure. He always had an idea that he wanted to publish an historical fiction, kind of following in the footsteps of Walter Scott, who wrote all those wonderful Waverley novels about Scotland and the heroes in the Scottish lore. American Notes, also kind of a failure. In fact, burned in America. He wrote this after he toured America, and it was not entirely favorable, even though he was feted, I guess is the right word, when he was here. A Christmas Carol, of course, immortal. That was an immediate success and continues today. And I don't know about your house, but when it comes time for Christmas, we take out the little Dickens village. You know, how many of you have little Dickens villages? You know, so people set those things up. Martin Chuzzlewit, not a success. So he had these, he had hits and he had misses. So the second bundle, the mature author, at the top of his game, producing wonderful, wonderful works that people are still enthralled, starts around Dombey and Sons. Now I notice it says 1848 when it was published, but that's when actually he was writing in serials. So he'd been writing it since 1846, came out in 24 editions, monthly editions. So 1848 was when it came out collected and then published as a trilogy. So he's starting with Dombey and Sons, David Copperfield, Bleak House, and you can see the list going through Great Expectations, Our Mutual Friend. These are all masterpieces. He listened to the critics. He had taken a couple of years. He was traveling through Europe. He changed his style of planning for books. Oliver Twist, Nicholas Nickleby, those just honestly kind of came out of his genius. There's a story about him writing Oliver Twist. He was finishing the Pickwick Papers. He was writing Oliver Twist. He was actually co-writing a play. He was writing a libretto for an opera all at the same time. And a friend came to visit. It was about, I don't know, 10, 11 o'clock at night. You know, Mr. Dickens, would you come down and see? So he comes down out of his study and, he has a friend that comes to visit. He sits down by the fireplace and he continues to write Oliver Twist while carrying on a conversation with his friend. Dickens is often at his best when he was spontaneous. And in fact, Nicholas Nickleby has this wonderful, wonderful section. It's episodic. As I said, it doesn't, you wonder how did he get here from this point? But Nicholas Nickleby, the hero of the book, joins a traveling troupe of actors. And Dickens was very interested in the theater, loved to act, and loved to write plays. He wasn't very good at it, but he liked it. And so there's this hilarious section where he's with a troupe of actors. It's worth reading the book just for that. So around 1848, what is going on in Dickens' life? Well, he's had some real disappointments. He's reflecting upon his childhood, very conflicted, very difficult time with both of his parents. And they continued to be difficult for him. He loved them dearly, but they took advantage of him. And he's reflecting on that. He's been married a number of years now. I forget the exact number, I'm sorry, but his marriage is breaking apart at this point. Not yet, but he's asking himself some very, very difficult questions, and they're showing up in his characters. And he doesn't have answers to these questions himself, and neither do his characters, and they're living through these. So there are questions like, well, why do we want what we can't have? Very difficult, very mature question. How can we understand the wrongs that have been done to us in our life? And maybe some of the wrongs that we've done to others. How do we deal with that? How do we break free from our past? Can we, in fact, break free from our past? And you'll see this in David Copperfield, Bleak House, Great Expectations. You begin to see that even at the end of these novels, the bad people get punished, the good people get rewarded. There are some marriages, but the possibilities for fulfillment and success, they appear to be limited. But so this is an incredibly mature work from a terrific author who has now understand how to make his work unified versus episodic, as in the beginning. For instance, I'll go one and then I got to get off this slide. I've got to move on. Great Expectations, 1860, 1861. So the book starts in a cemetery with a lot of mist all over the place because it's foggy physically, but also it's kind of foggy mentally for the characters within the book. And it ends in the mist in Miss Havisham's kind of destroyed garden and home with mist rising. But it's not just mist at the beginning, mist at the end. I mean, that's one thing, sure, that's just a little trick. But the novel, it takes place in only two places. It doesn't take place as a traveling novel like Nickleby or The Old Curiosity Shop. It takes place in Kent and takes place in London for the most part. two centers of action. At the very beginning of the novel, the hero Pip is a little boy and he's in the cemetery and he's looking at the gravestones of his two parents who are dead and his 5 siblings who were dead. And out of the mist comes Abel Magwitch, who's an escaped convict. And he grabbed, if you remember, he grabs Pip by the ankles and he turns him upside down. And now you see the world through Pip's eyes as he's looking at everything upside down. Well, this is a time when you can use the words literally and figuratively to make sense. Literally, Pip was turned upside down by Abel Magwitch, and figuratively, it changed his entire life, because Magwitch becomes the source of money for Pip to become a gentleman, and it changes. And so he's got imagery working for him and centralized action, and he really has learned how to make a unified novel that everybody loves today. So, I mean, this is pretty impressive work. Let's just go on to the next slide, and let's see, Donna, how do I get to my next slide? I don't know either. There we go. That's not all. He wrote over 200 short stories, 2 travel books, hundreds of essays, because actually these magazines that he was editing, he did most of them, although he did have a cadre of actors, a cadre of writers who worked with him. Several plays, which he mostly would co-author. Writing for the stage and writing fiction, different. And he wasn't that good at it, to be honest. Now, we all know the Christmas Carol, but, you know, he wrote 5 Christmas carols. There were 5 editions of his Christmas stories year after year. He tried for almost a year to be actually the editor of the Daily News, and he was not good at that either. That is not where his talent lay. But he tried out editing a newspaper. So altogether, 20 years of editing a weekly or a monthly literary magazine. And then he took his act to the stage and started reading throughout England, Scotland, Wales, Ireland, and he did a dramatic reading across America as well. Incredibly, incredibly active person. So what are we going to cover? English novelist before Dickens. Very, very fast. He wasn't the first novelist. I just want to give you with like one quick takeaway from these other authors. We're going to talk a little bit about money. In fact, I want to do that very next, because you need to understand pounds, shillings, etc. And there's a little conversion factor we can use to relate that to today's. Were the English readers when he started out? We're talking about the rise of the novel. Well, were they readers? Weren't they? Who were some of his contemporaries in the trade? Publishers, printers, booksellers. I want to introduce you to a couple of these people. Then we're back into Dickens. So, and I'll try to move ahead quickly. So pounds is that funny looking L. Shillings is S. And D, strangely enough, is pence. Let me bring all of these up one after the other and then save the best for last here. So at the low end of the currency, the D, where does that D? So we have pennies, half pennies, farthings, which is a quarter of a penny. You know, if you were to give something to a beggar along the street, chances are it'd be a farthing, quarter of a penny. And that came, don't forget, Rome was in England for about 400 to 500 years. So a lot of, there's a lot of terminology that comes from that time period. Denarius was a Roman coin, D, so that's where you get D for penny. And if you have 2 pennies, now you have pence. And if you have a dozen pence, you have a shilling, which comes from the Old English word skilling. Next up is a crown, that's 5 shillings, right? So that's 60 pennies. Then 20 shillings is a pound, and that funny looking L is from Latin libra, which was actually a pound weight. And then there's a guinea, and it gets there's even more. English money is kind of funny. But here's the one takeaway that I want from this slide. There are, fortunately now, conversion factors that you can use in Google. So a pound in 1830 in American dollars today, $141.91. So kind of rounded up. I'm thinking either $140, $150 right in that area for 1 pound. So a pound was a lot of money. And by the middle of the 19th century, a skilled engineer would get about 110 pounds a year. So that's what that type of level of a professional would make. If you had a family of 4 and you had 50 pounds a year, you could kind of get by. You know, if you had anywhere 57 to 78, you're kind of comfortable. Round it up again, give it a little extra. So if you think 100 pounds a year, family of 4 can live on that. So that's the main takeaway here. Now, who preceded him? Well, there were many. I picked 6. Daniel Defoe, 1660 was when he was born. So he wrote Robinson Crusoe, 1719, Amal Flanders. Samuel Richardson actually came up with a epistolary. He wrote novels, and they were all letters, just collections of letters. Henry Fielding, we know because of the history of Tom Jones. Each of these writers, each of these men, and Jane Austen, they all have terrific stories behind them. And I'd love to have the chance to tell you some of these stories, but there just isn't time. For instance, Henry Fielding, look at his book, Shamala, in 1741. What a strange name. Why would he pick Shamala? Because he hated Samuel Richardson, whose first book was Pamela. So Pamela was this virtuous woman. Henry Fielding hated the whole book. He didn't like Richardson, his first book, and he wouldn't give up on it. Pamela's last name was Andrews, so now he writes Joseph Andrews, who is a male servant in the household, and the women are always trying to seduce him. This is very racy stuff. It's great fun. Lawrence Sterne, who wrote there was never a book like The Life and Opinion of Tristram Shandy. It just came out of nowhere. It was brilliant. A stream of consciousness technique was developed by Lawrence Sterne. And we just can't say enough about Jane Austen, genius. All of these men before her started writing in their late 50s or late 40s. She started writing at 11. And then there's Walter Scott, who did the Waverley novels. He was a poet, a very, very famous poet before he decided to write these novels. And of course, he couldn't publish under his own name because novelists weren't gentlemen. His first book was called Waverley, and then he wrote 26 other Waverley novels. So I'm using the word novel. Novel comes from the Italian novella, which meant short story. And a novel is a longer story in fiction. And what these writers here and others contributed is the idea of social awareness, social relevance, social awareness, I guess, is the best phrase to use at this point, so that a reader could see themselves in the reality that they knew in these works. Characters started to develop the tools and techniques for character development as opposed to just stock characters or characterizations. You know, you notice on this set of 6 people, we don't have Gulliver's Travels, up here, because that was almost not a work of fiction in the sense that you could see yourself in it. It was kind of more of a fable. Stock characters. So at any rate, these are some of the early 18th and 19th centuries on the shoulders of whom Dickens and others stood. Now, if you really want to have a literary society, you need 3 things. You need people who can read. So how did England do in regards to literacy? Not very well, as Dickens was starting out writing in the 30s or so. By 1840, 40% of the men and 60% of the women could not read. But by 1890, you're up to 97% literacy. So what does that tell you? It tells you that schools were starting up. People were finding value in knowing how to read. It was important to them. They were working at it. And as a country, they made significant progress. But certainly in the 1830s and 40s, how did they read? How did the Pickwick Papers become so famous if only 40% of the men and 60% of the women were illiterate? Actually, the folks who could not read had listening clubs. They would pull their pence and they would hire a reader, and you'd find people in barber shops or on the grocery stores, if we can call them that, where you get your goods. and there'd be somebody who could read to them. And with the picnic papers, there would be waiting every month after month to find out what was happening in the next edition. So a second thing that you need to have a real literate society is a ready supply of books. Well, in 1800, most books were actually handmade. We're dealing with the time of the Industrial Revolution and steam power, but it wasn't until about 1815 or so when steam-powered printing presses came into being. So it was hard to make a book, and they were expensive, which we're going to talk about also. But by the 1830s, there was some rapid improvement. And of course, even if the technology existed in 1815, there wasn't a push for it. There wasn't a mercantile interest. And there weren't enough people who were really buying these books. And also, this is the third point, affordability. Books were expensive and often for artificial means. So what arrived around 1840 was something called the circulating library, which we don't have anymore, but we used to have, and we all remember them, places where you would go and rent a video, right? You could buy a video for $30 or $40, but why would you do that if you could get a membership in, what were some of the books, the video chain stores that were out there? I forget what they were. Blockbuster Video. That's it. Blockbuster Video. You know, you join, you go, you rent a video. Well, there were circulating libraries. You'd go and you would rent a book. And Moody's was the most popular, and they had actually 1 million books on site in their London store. There were stores throughout. I'm looking for one particular reference that I have here. That's right. There were stores throughout England and out Scotland, not too many in Wales, but this is where you would go to get your book. Now, Mr. Moody is right. Whoops, we want to go back. Mr. Moody became an incredibly influential figure, not just in Charles Dickens' life, but also in the lives of Thackeray, George Eliot, all of the writers who were popular at the time, because he had great control over volume. For instance, Great Expectations, when it was published, Charles Edward Moody bought out the entire first run, bought them all. And so you immediately able to go to the second printing. Imagine the purchasing power that he had and the influence that he had over authors. Because if he felt that they were too racy, he wouldn't buy them. Or he'd go back through your publisher and he'd say, I really want you to get this section changed. It's not right for our society. He had Victorian morals, and he applied them, and people really did rebel against it. Here's another fact that I was able to put up. In 1830, there were only 1,100 books that were published of all sorts in England. So very few books were being published at that point in time. That really quickly changed. Walter Scott developed this technique of writing a book that was a trilogy, came out in 3 parts. Well, Mr. Moody liked that, and he insisted that the books come out in 3 parts. So this had a big effect on how authors actually structured their work. And he wanted that because he could rent the same book to 3 different people at the same time. It was really a moneymaker for him. And I have this little subheading here. How much does the book cost? The average price of a book was $170 at this time. So people weren't buying books. And this was largely because Mr. Moody wanted it that way. For instance, in the United States in around 1850, Moby Dick came out. You could buy that book for $1.50 in the United States. In England, that book was called The Whale. It cost $215. So, you know, people went to the circulating library, and here for, 1 volume at a time, it would be 12 shillings. And if you wanted a 12-month subscription, £1, 1 shilling. So it was affordable for people, and that's the way they did it. Now, I want to introduce you to a publisher. Oh, I'm sorry, I got ahead of myself. So you could get your literature through Mr. Moody's circulating library. The other way, as we saw Mr. Dickens, he was an editor of monthly and then weekly magazines. Well, this was the age of magazines. And people got their literature by buying them. Some of these magazines, Household Words, cost 2 pennies. So people could go out and they could get these magazines on the cheap. There were magazines for essays, reviews, fictions, poetry. They were all published in this little area right next to St. Paul's Church called Paternoster Row. That was the center. It was a frenetic hub of activity of book publishing, and they distributed books to wholesalers and booksellers throughout the country. Here, I found this little picture on Wikipedia. Can you picture in 1830 Charlotte Bronte with her sisters and her brother out in the moors, and here she is a child, and she's at play, and they're writing their own magazine. You know, it was just a very popular thing to do. The Strand magazine, where you'd get your Sherlock Holmes stories, Saturday magazine. There were just, 80 magazines in 1817, 200 of them in 1837. So people were getting into magazine publishing. That was a way to make extra money. So here's the publisher I want you. Everybody had to have a publisher. You write a novel, you want to get it into print, you got to go through publishers, print, and you have to go through printers in order to do it. That's the way the trade works. Henry Colburn is a publisher that is extraordinaire, a man of great energy. And he was actually reputedly the bastard son of the illegitimate son, I should say, I guess, of the Duke of York, who was the king's brother. So he kind of grew up in high society. And he had the idea of producing what were called silver fork novels. Why were they called that? Because they were written by people who were used to the way the upper class lived. There was a lot of new money in England around this time, 1830s and 1840s, and people wanted to emulate the styles of the rich people. And these silver fork novels showed how rich people lived. Now, Colburn always had an eye towards making money, although he went bankrupt. And he got the idea of doing product placement. So he would go to a manufacturer of a product and say, I'll get your name into this book, but that's going to cost you some money. I mean, we do that today. If you look at a TV show and you see somebody holding up a Coca-Cola can, product placement, they're getting some money for that one. So he would push these Macassar oils or seltzer water. He was the first to actually advertise books in newspapers. He was a public relations man. He would put up posters of people and of authors alongside of buses. He did everything he could in order to get an author well known, even going to the point where he would hire people to go to dinners and talk about a book and try to talk it up. Now, some of his novelists, Bulwer Lytton was one who was actually a baron. So he was from the upper class, a great friend of Dickens. William Ainsworth was a high quality lawyer. Lady Morgan, obviously somebody from nobility. Disraeli, who became the Prime Minister of England in his early days, wrote for Henry Colburn, and he would pay up to £2,000. Now remember, a pound, $150, £2,000. That's a couple $100,000 in today's money. Well, not surprisingly, he went bankrupt. I mean, he did push a lot of novels out there. There was a depression in the 1830s. He merged with another printer, whom we'll get to learn more about, Mr. Bentley. Here's a book that the frontispiece, Paul Clifford. And you can see author of Pelham and Devereux. This was written by Bulwer Lytton, but you wouldn't know it unless, you would think, oh, who wrote Pelham? Oh, I like that book. Okay, I'll get this one. It was in 3 volumes, which Mr. Moody insisted on. This is volume 1, and you can see at the bottom, published by Henry Colburn and Richard Bentley, who went into partnership in 1830. Now, you probably never heard of this book, Paul Clifford, but the first sentence has 7 words in it. I'm going to give you the first 5 and see if you can come up with the last 2. It was a dark and stormy night is the answer. Right. So this, and even today there are contests to see who can make the worst beginning of a novel. It's called the Bulwer-Lytton contest after Mr. Bulwer-Lytton. But he gave us other phrases. The Great Unwashed was one of his. In Pursuit of the Almighty Dollar. So there's this picture. If I get a chance and I come back and you want me to do another lecture, I'll tell you some stories about Bulwer-Lytton. He was a complex person, not nice. William Ainsworth, very handsome lawyer. Lady Morgan, beautiful lady. Benjamin Disraeli doing his best to look like Dickens, not Dickens, I'm sorry. Dylan. Bob Dylan. I think he looks like Bob Dylan. That just may be me. So here's another name I want you to know. Henry Colburn and Richard Bentley. And there's Mr. Bentley himself. Okay, so now let's go back to Mr. Dickens. I've given you some background. How am I doing for time? Okay, good. I'm doing okay. So what was going on with Dickens in England at this time? Still reacting to the Napoleonic Wars and the French Revolution. Don't forget, in 1790, they were chopping off heads in Paris. The French Revolution had a big impact on England. But there was money around in the 30s and 40s. The middle class was growing. They were wanting to, as I said before, emulate the upper class. But there were boom and bust times. People were investing in railroads. Some of that would pay off. They'd invest in railroads in Mexico that would fail. There was some uncertainty, certainly, at this time. Industrial Revolution. What was happening to the farmers and the artisans? Well, there was steam power going everywhere. It caused great unrest within the countryside. People, where did they go? They moved to the cities. And what were the cities like? Well, there was the 1%ers, the people with a lot of money, and they had terrific homes, beautiful homes. But most people didn't have that. They lived in squalor like this. Why was this alleyway pitched towards the center? Because you threw your swill out into the alleys. There were no toilets. You threw what you collected in a little bucket. You threw that out into the alleys, and it just ran down the center. There was cholera. There was all sorts of terrible diseases, typhoid, etc. There was no child labor protections. There were orphans everywhere. People came to the city. There were no social safety nets. People starved. Children were put to work in factories. No protection. No schools. However, the churches, after a while, around the 40s or so, they started to react to this, and they created what were called ragged schools. And the churches were called ragged because people showed up in rags. There were no schools per se. They taught in wherever they could, sometimes under bridges, any place they could get an area together and get the children to try to give them a little education. And London at the time was the largest city on the face of the earth. Terrific construction going on. It was a harsh, harsh time, but not without a sense of optimism and energy. And Dickens fed off all of that. Now, what about Dickens himself? I call this the early years, abandonment and success. So here's John Dickens, that's Dickens' father, and Elizabeth, his mom. Well, John worked for the Navy Pay Department, and he was profligate. He always overspent himself. And he got moved from location to location because of his work. And every time they moved, it was to a less and less prosperous home. Elizabeth tried to help out. She tried to open a school, but she never once got a pupil. And so eventually his overspending caught up with him. And he could see, there was something called debtors' prisons. Maybe you haven't heard of them, maybe you have. I'm going to show you one. That was where if you didn't have the money to pay your bills and somebody took suit against you, you would go and be put in jail until you paid. Doesn't seem to make any sense because you couldn't work when you were in there. Well, John knew that his major creditor, who was a baker, that he owed 70 pounds to, which is about $9,000, He had to have gotten furniture or something from the baker. I don't know what he got, but he knew he was going to be put in debtor's prison. He, they had 8 children, John and Elizabeth. 2 of them died young. The oldest was a girl named Elizabeth called Fanny. She could sing. And so John and Elizabeth put her in a boarding school so she could get educated and develop this artistry of singing. Charles was the second. He was the oldest boy. And John took him out of school at age 12 and put him to work in a friend's factory. He had a friend that owned a blacking factory. And about 3 weeks before he gets put into debtor's prison, Charles goes to work at the blacking factory. Now, the family continued to live outside for a short period of time, but your family could go and live with you in debtor's prison too. So he takes the whole family except Elizabeth, who's at school, and Charles, who's working at the blacking factory, and they all move into Marshalsea prison together. Now, John has to stay there, but the rest of the family can come in and go out. So Charles, and you can understand this, he's a 12-year-old boy. His sisters, older sisters, in school. He wants to be in school. He had won all sorts of prizes when he was in school. He knew he was smart. And here he is at this factory, Warren's Blacking Factory. It's not a great picture, but it was on the Thames River, and it was loaded with rats, and it was decrepit. The wood was rotting. The rats would run up and down the stairs all day long. There was a whole bunch of boys down in the basement. They were actually making, blacking is shoe polish. They were making the shoe polish. Charles was upstairs. They called him the little gentleman. He had a bit of an accent that wasn't a Cockney accent. It was kind of more high class. He was short. He was cute. They put him in the window where he would put labels on the bottles and tie a little string around them. And he was mortified, and he was angry, resentful. And his whole family was living in the prison. He had an apartment. They put him into a house. Nobody took care of him. He's 12 years old. He's hypersensitive. And he has to walk 5 miles to get to the blacking factory, and then 5 miles back to where he's living. Nobody's giving him food to eat, whatever. If he can have a loaf of bread and a little milk, that's what he gets. He starts wandering the streets of London at night, which is a habit he kept his entire life. He could walk 10, 20 miles a night around the city of London. He knew London like no one knew London. It happened that finally, after a number of months, much to John's relief, his mother died, and he got a lot of money. And not a lot, but he got enough to get himself, pay off his debts, get out of prison. He keeps Charles working at the factory. Now, as I said before, Charles's mother could get out, and she would every once in a while go visit him at the factory. She saw the conditions he worked in. She saw the rats. He complained bitterly to her about his situation, but they needed the 6 pence a week that he was making. And so they kept him working there. Even when his father got out of the prison, paid off his debts, they kept him working there for about another, it's not determined. Even in this little figment of an autobiography that Dickens wrote, it's unclear. It could have been 6 months that he stayed working there. And finally, one day, Charles Dickens' father shows up at the blacking factory to see him, and he's horrified at the conditions. And actually, his pride was hurt. How can my son be working here in this window, showing himself to everybody, rats running all over the place? This is terrible. So he has this lengthy conversation with his wife at night, where he's saying, I'm going to have him leave that place. And Dickens is watching his parents argue, and the mother is arguing, no, he's going to stay working there. We need the money. He's going to stay working. And the father and mother arguing. He never, ever, for the rest of his life, forgave his mother for that, which maybe haunted him with some of these questions like, well, can I escape my past? What about the hurt that's been done to me? And here's a quotation that he gave to his biographer, John Forster, I really believed at that time they had broken my heart. Well, nevertheless, things got better. He went to school again, stayed in school until he was 15. He learned how to write shorthand, which was immensely, it was just starting out at that point in time. He became a master of it. And he got a job after 15 at a law office. He worked there delivering papers, going around London. And as I said, nobody knew the back streets of London like Charles Dickens did. And so he was very fast, he was quick. A lot of his books deal with legal issues, some facts that he kind of picked up in that couple of years. He started writing for newspapers, first as a freelancer. He did that for 2 years. Then he kind of got a promotion and they put him into Parliament. People were amazed at how fast he could write down the words that the parliamentary people were, the ministers were saying, and then he'd get it into print and then get it into the newspaper. Then he really started to be a reporter for the True Sun, and then finally the Evening and Morning Chronicle. So he made his living for a number of years, formative years, as a newspaper writer. Now, if you wanted to scoop somebody and you had something you had to write that was taking place away from London, well, the only way you got there was by stagecoach. So he did a lot of stagecoach travel, which shows up in his novels. And in order to scoop anybody, he would write everything down that he had to. He'd attend the meetings. He'd hop on board a stagecoach, travel through the night, and be writing his stories in the stagecoach, if you can picture that, and then race over to the newspaper office and get his articles into print. Now, George Hogarth was the editor of the Evening and Morning Chronicles, and Dickens made the most of that connection. So he starts to write sketches. So he doesn't want to be a newspaper author, although he thought of newspaper reporter, he thought about that, but he thought, you know what, I really want more of a literary career. So his sketches were simply that, not a novel. They were little things that he would write about a neighborhood, or things he noticed about the cabmen and how they would signal each other as they walked by, or the florist. So certainly he wrote about the jails, Marshalsea Prison, etc. And he wrote 56 of them, as it said, and they got put together and bound in 2 volumes, which we had mentioned earlier, 1836. You can see also, it says illustrated by George Cruikshank. He was one of the most famous illustrators of his day. He and Charles worked together on this and then 1 or 2 other projects as well. So, so as a result of these sketches, now I'm going to go over a little bit, and I apologize for that, but we're getting closer. So, as a result of these sketches, he gets noticed by these 2 people, William Hall and Edward Chapman. And they, at this point in their careers, they were booksellers. They had a stationery shop, and they wanted to kind of move up in the food chain and be in print magazines. And so they got an idea that what we could do, because what was popular was some Hogarth prints. Those were even from the prior century, the 18th century, but they came back into vogue. And they were very, very detailed, these Hogarth prints. You read them, and they, as opposed to just looking at them, and there were captions underneath it. And they thought, well, you know, people like this type of thing. We could publish a magazine, and there's these stories that are being written by Richard Surtees called Jorrocks, Jaunts and Jollities. What a title. And it's about Cockneys in London who've come into some money, want to emulate the rich people, and they want to go out in the countryside and be sportsmen. So he said, we're going to put together a monthly magazine, and it's going to be about this. And they noticed the articles, these sketches by Boz, and they said, we'll just hire this guy. We're going to pay him £14 for every edition that he writes. We're going to do it for 2 years. If we sell 400 of them, we're going to be fine. So let's go hire Boz. They had an illustrator, Richard Seymour, his name was, also very well known. And he's going to do 4 illustrations and then we're going to have just all this print around it. Dickens is going to just kind of describe the illustrations. So what happens is Dickens says, great, I'll do this. He keeps the day job and as a reporter. So the first two editions, Dickens gets the idea. Pickwick, we're going to call it the Pickwick Papers, because he saw Moses Pickwick written alongside of a coach. And he liked the name of this, he liked the sound of it. So he said, fine. The first two editions, complete failure. They had hoped 400, if we could sell 400. Well, they couldn't, failures. And then I noticed, I had this dot item, tragic circumstance and a big break. What happens? Richard Seymour committed suicide. The illustrator killed himself. He actually blew his brains out with a shotgun. So Holland Chapman said, well, that's the end of that adventure. But Dickens says, no. Trust me, I'm going to write the whole thing. We're going to cut the illustrations from 4 to 2, and it's going to be great. And don't you worry about it. It's going to be fun. And he talks him into it, and it turns into the Pickwick Papers. So the third edition, not so good. Fourth edition gets a little bit better. By the fifth month, he introduces a character called Sam Weller, who's the butler to Mr. Pickwick. And he's a Cockney, and Pickwick gets into trouble, and then Sam Weller saves him, and it caught on, and it went just fabulously well. As I said, they hoped to sell 400 copies per month. By the end of the 24 months, they were selling 40,000 copies. And there were clubs that would get together. There were Pickwick songs, there were picnic memorabilia. Dickens, at the age of 25, is famous throughout England, Scotland, Wales, Ireland, Europe, and America. And so what happens next? Do you remember Mr. Colburn? I introduced you to him, and his partner, Richard Bentley. Well, they break up. You know, Bentley accuses Colburn of stealing money. Bentley gets into the magazine business and says, we're going to create something called Bentley's Miscellany. I want the hottest author in town to be my editor. He seeks out, well, Boz, who is Charles Dickens. That's the anonymous name that he picked. Dickens says, well, okay, I'll be your editor, but I have an idea for a book and I want you to publish it. And he talks Bentley into giving him 500 pounds to write Oliver Twist. Remember, 100 pounds a year feeds a family of 4. So he strikes the deal. Oliver Twist, fabulous success. George Cruikshank is the illustrator, and it goes great. Then he gets the idea, I'm going to write a second book. And the second book is Nicholas Nickleby, edited by Boz. He has a different illustrator, Fizz. People are wondering, what's it going to be about? Is it going to be Pickwick 2? We love Pickwick. Well, it's not. It's about child abuse. It's about, I'm sorry, I'm talking here obviously about Oliver Twist. Kidnapping, child abuse, thievery, murder. The second book is Nicholas Nickleby. What's that about? Well, he hears about schools close to the Scottish border that actually are schools where people, if they have illegitimate children that are an embarrassment to them, they send people off to the schools and they're never heard of again. The schools promise, even in their advertising, there are no vacations. So Dickens wants to investigate this. He is a reporter. He takes Fizz, his illustrator. They take a coach. They go up to the border near Scotland. They investigate this school. They find gravestones for 29 children who just dead and buried because of terrific abuse. So he writes this novel about Nicholas Nickleby, turns into a traveling story, turns into a comedy, and it's really wonderful, and it was a terrific success as well. Now, a note about the Christmas carols. As I said, there was a huge movement into London. So there was a 64% increase in the United Kingdom population from 1812 to 1843, many going into London. Industrial revolution, child labor, poor working, just all of it, social unrest, the sewerage untreated, running in the streets, people getting ill. So the government finally in 1842 says, well, we really have to have a good, thoughtful approach to this. So they commission a report, not just on labor, but on sanitation. And so there's this report that comes out, and it calls for vast amounts of urban redevelopment and the creation of a social network. Now, the powers that be did not want this at all. They were not interested in taking care of children. The political economist Thomas Malthus, his work came back into being. He thought it's not government's role to help poor people because we can never feed them. We'll never have enough productivity. We just have to leave them alone. If we encourage them, there's going to be more poor people. I mean, you can almost hear, let them go starve. You can hear that. So Marx and Engels, who wrote the Communist Manifesto, read the same report, and they start working on their massive work about the Communist Manifesto. Dickens reads the report, and he's well aware of these social conditions, and he writes A Christmas Carol, which at the end of the day is not about the ghosts. At the end of the day, it's about Scrooge taking care of Bob Cratchit's family, giving an increase in wages, and even helping with childcare. So he had originally thought he would publish simply a pamphlet, but he went to one of the ragged schools and he became moved. He actually wrote the Christmas Carol inside of 6 weeks. And it immediately sold out and kept on selling out. And then year after year, he wrote more books somewhat like this. So Dickens, the man, what was he like? Well, full of energy, passion. He was at his best when he totally pushed himself to the absolute extremes of physical and mental endurance, as Mr. Ackroyd says in his biography. He knew exactly what he wanted, very self-assured and extremely bossy, difficult to work with. He did have George Cruikshank as an illustrator on a couple of his works, but Cruikshank and he became enemies. If they saw each other on the street, they would get on opposite sides. He was difficult as a person. He was very melancholy. He could be charming, energetic, just the life of the party. And then when everybody left, he would kind of turn, and become very difficult. He loved, look at this illustration. The first time I know Linda Bogdanoff saw it, she said, that guy looks like a lady. Well, he was very fancy in his dress. There is a wonderful book in the Newburyport Public Library that describes Dickens' 2 visits to Boston. And it's a collection of letters of people about it. So Dickens went to this, there were public dinners for him where he would give a lecture, hundreds and hundreds of people, and they would be dressed in a black suit coat like this one. Dickens had a scarlet red suit coat. That was one of them. The other was a bright, bright green. And he would put jewelry all over them. He wore jewelries and big rings on his fingers. Sometimes he'd go around London with just one arm in a suit coat and the rest of it kind of hanging off the side like he was a Russian soldier. He loved dressing up. He certainly was a family man, but a little unusual. And my subtitle is here, Oh, Those Hogarth Girls. So George Hogarth was his boss as a reporter, and Hogarth had 3 daughters. And so Charles fell in love with Catherine and married her at a very young age, and they had 10 children. Well, when he toured the United States the first time, they left the children behind, and Mary Hogarth was the second Hogarth daughter, Catherine's sister. And so they had Catherine move into the house. Mary move into the house to take care of the children. When they came back, Mary stayed. And Dickens and Mary would go around town together, Catherine not always. Mary, at the age of 18, died suddenly of a heart attack in Charles Dickens' arms, literally in his arms. And it took Dickens years to get over it. He kept all of her clothes, and from time to time could be seen holding her dresses to his face and weeping openly, which is, I think, a little unusual. At any rate, Mary is dead, and the next sister is Georgina, and she moves into the household, and she stays right to the very end until Charles dies. And she took care of the household. As I said, the Dickens family was large. He and Catherine had 10 children. I think that's Catherine in that kind of plaid dress and Charles with the beard. And as I said earlier, the marriage became not what Dickens wanted. He was the man about town. He was always going out. He was giving lectures. He was feted everywhere. Catherine had 10 children. Hey, you have 10 children. See how you look, And so Catherine put on a little extra weight. And somewhere around 1856, as Dickens is on stage, because he did acting as well, he meets Ellen Tiernan, who's 18 years of age, and he falls in love. And Ellen Tiernan and Charles had a relationship right up to the time when he died. So anyhow, he's trying to keep his marriage and he's trying to keep his relationship with Ellen going, and he decides he's going to give Ellen a brooch, a lovely, lovely jewel. And this is out of a plot of a terrible novel, but it really happened. The jeweler mixed it up and sent it to his wife with a lovely note from Charles to Ellen. So she reads it. It causes huge family fight and breakup. And Catherine leaves the house at Charles's insistence. And the family kind of breaks up certainly a little bit. And strangely enough, Catherine's sister, Georgina, stays with Charles, doesn't go with her sister. So her loyalty was to Charles Dickens. So, family man, but a little unusual. In the 50s, he also decides to take his readings on stage, and he was a brilliant actor. He had many, many voices, so he could take on the role of his different characters. He even took on the role of, in Oliver Twist, towards the end of his life, of the murder scene of Bill Sikes and Nancy. And he just threw every bit of energy he had into that role. He had congenital heart failure, and he had to have a doctor always waiting because he would be exhausted at the end of it. He did tour the United States, did this reading. People advised him not to, but he earned 20,000 pounds, which is a couple of $1 million from that tour. So at any rate, I'm now up to the end. I knew I'd go over an hour. So Dickens' death, June 9th, 1870. He's 58 years old. He died at his home, Gads Hill Place near Rochester in Kent, which is close to where he grew up as a little boy. There are two stories by this. One is that he was having dinner alone at his home. Georgina was there. He stood up. He said, "I've got to go to London." He collapsed and had a stroke and he died. The other story, and I don't know which is true, is that he was at Ellen Tiernan's house because he bought a house for Ellen. And he was at a house and he had a stroke there. She somehow got him into a carriage, got him back home, and that was the story. So he was buried in Poets' Corner. It was a private viewing, but followed 2 days. The next 2 days were open to the public, and thousands of people paid their respects. So he started as a poor person, and his father in debtor's prison, working in a shoe polish factory. And he ended up with the equivalent today of $9 million in his estate, and fabulously successful really throughout the world. And that's his story. So I can conclude my remarks here, and if there are some questions, I'd be doing my best so we can open it up to everybody. We'll stop sharing. And if I went too fast, I apologize, but I had so much I wanted to cover.
You can,
You can unmute, we can unmute everybody. Or if you have a question, you can unmute yourself.
Did you unmute us?
We can hear you.
Okay, okay. That was great. That
Oh,
was great. Really interesting. Presentation was,
Bill, how long did it take you to read everything?
about a year.